Awesome. So this is a hallway hangout on March 14th for me, maybe March 15th for some other folks on this call, on all things layout. So this is a complex topic going pretty deep. So I have two guests joining me, Isabel and Saxon, and I will let them introduce themselves. But just as a reminder, this is just meant to be casual, collaborative, informative. If you're watching this later and have questions, feel free to follow up on the recap, and we'll track down those answers as well. So, Isabel, do you mind introducing yourself briefly? Maybe who you are, where you work, where you live?
Yeah, I'm Isabel, and I work at Automatic. I'm a full-time contributor to WordPress core, and for the past, I want to say almost about a year or so, I've been working pretty much only on layout and sort of layout adjacent problems such as root padding and things like that. And I live in Sydney, Australia.
Awesome. Yeah, you're knee deep in a lot of this work, so I really appreciate being you. And Saxon.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Saxon. I'm a product designer at Automatic. Spent most of my time contributing to Gutenberg, have dabbled a little bit in layout recently, but still have a ton to learn there. So excited about this conversation, getting stuck into a few things.
Yeah, you and me both. Isabel, do you mind jumping just straight in to kind of, I know you have like a wealth of knowledge to share in a little bit of a presentation. So
I've got a bit of a demo that I used for a recent talk I did at WordCamp Asia. And so if I share my screen, let me see if I can do that.
Like hopefully you have access.
Let me see which desktop I want to share. I think that is the correct desktop. Yep. Okay,
Awesome.
so can you see my screen?
Yes.
This is the site editor. So I have like a full demo of everything that you can possibly do with layout. I thought for this to be quicker, I'm just going to focus on the new features that we have in 6.2. So just sort of the very latest things that have been done. So I'm going to assume that there's a little bit of sort of prior knowledge of types of layout that exist, which have been around for a while, like layout as a feature in WordPress core. It's been in core since 5.9, and with sort of the user interface has had a few little bits and pieces of change, but nothing huge. So I'm expecting that most of the controls are probably familiar to folks, like the basic controls at least already. So what's new in 6.2? There's some really exciting stuff, stuff that folks have been wanting, like particularly theme authors have given a lot of feedback on and wanted to have for ages, like features that allow you to build more complex layouts and more interesting layouts. So the first thing I'm going to show is for row and stack blocks. So row and stack blocks are flex based. So essentially under the hood, it's CSS display flex, and it's either for the row a horizontal layout or for the column a vertical layout. And until 6.2, there wasn't very much that you could do apart from put blocks inside these row or stack layouts, and there wasn't a lot of flexibility in terms of how you could manage the resulting layout. But there's a couple of things that have been introduced now that will help a lot. So first, for the row block, let me see, I always want to jump into the list view when I'm looking in the site editor because there's always lots of blocks, so it gets a bit complicated to navigate. But here is a row block in the header. Is that the right zoom level for everyone? Can you see clearly what's going on in my screen?
I might have to zoom
in or out a bit, depending on what we're doing. Okay, so so up to now we have these sort of different types of justification where you can justify left, right, or space between for row elements, but it's sometimes we want, so let's say I want a site logo next to my site title, and I'm just going to move it here, but I really wanted the site title to be next to the logo and sort of to one side, whereas the navigation should be to the other side. And now with the new controls that we've introduced, we can actually do this. So children of row blocks or stack blocks will get dimension controls. If you go into styles and dimensions, that's right here at the bottom, I hope it's visible, you'll see there's a width setting under dimensions. This is for the child block of row. And if you enable width, it pops up a little toggle and you can set it to several. So you can set a fixed width on this element. It's essentially the width is the space that element occupies within the Flex container. So I could say, I could set it to like, I don't know, 600 pixels and it would make it bigger. But the really interesting control, I think the best one that we have here is this fill option, which will basically stretch it to occupy the rest of the space that's available within the row. And so that means that my site title is now sitting next to my site logo, and then there's a navigation on the other side. So that's I think a pretty neat one. And then aside from that, there are a bunch of other controls that we introduced in row and stacks that I think might be better to showcase in another layout type. Oh, there's, okay, let me try and do this in order. Still in the site editor. We mentioned min height. I think, Anne, you mentioned that you'd like to see, okay, let's
that'd be awesome.
show you some min height. I think I've already got a layout here that can be usefully show this. Okay, so this is the 404 page in the 2023 theme. And this is not how it looks by default. By default, it kind of, the footer is kind of a bit closer to the content area. But what we did here is we wrapped everything. So we wrapped the whole page in the stack block. And the stack was given a minimum weight stack, select stack. And in the styles, we have given a minimum height to the stack, and the height we've given it is 90 viewport height units. This is viewport height units are proportionate to the height of your window. So, I mean, in theory, you could go 100 to make it occupy the full height of the viewport. But then if there's other elements, if there's like a toolbar on top or something like that, which you often have in WordPress, especially if you're logged in, you have this little toolbar at the top, it might actually create a scroll bar. So if I went in here and set that to 100, it's, no, page is scrolling. So 90 is kind of a nice number because it's, you know, the main content area is probably going to be roughly about that. And you can see that the footer is sticking to the bottom. And how did we do that? We selected the main content area, which is a child of the stack block, and we set its height to fill, so it fills the whole, because the stack has a fixed height now, or a minimum height, I should say, we can actually create more space inside it. And so one of the elements, the main content element area of this inside the stack block, can be made to occupy all the remaining height of the block. And that means that the footer, in the case of there not being a lot of content on the page, the footer always gets pushed down. If there is a lot of content in the page, then because it's just a minimum height, it's not a fixed height, it will still scroll as usual. So this wouldn't have any sort of negative repercussions for a page that had a lot of content in it. It's just a good way of making sure that the footer always sticks to the bottom when the page doesn't have a lot. So that's a use of minimum height, and that height control will appear in stack blocks, whereas the width control will appear in row blocks, because that is the dimension that we are able to control for each of those types of flex layouts. And okay, so what else do I have? There's another, can I actually?
That combination, by the way, just the combination of height, width plus justify and line just opens up so many more possibilities than it was previously.
Yeah, and they're really like small tools, but it's just the flexibility, the additional flexibility that they give you in terms of what kind of layouts you can do is really cool. So another one, I just want to show this because there's been a bunch of this kind of example has popped up a few times in issues in GitHub, with folks asking, how can I use layout tools to do this? And now with the new controls that we have provided, it is finally possible to build this kind of layout. So this is a kind of layout where you have a few cards, and I might just zoom out so you can see the full card. Okay, so we have a bunch of cards, and they'll have like a title, an image, and then a variable amount of text, and then at the bottom there'll be a button, right? And we want the cards to always have the same height, and we always want that button to stick to the bottom. There should probably be a margin. I mean, don't pay attention to the details of these crappy designs that I did just to exemplify what's possible. And so this is the situation. And previously we weren't able to do this because we didn't have, wait a minute, is this, oh, so okay, let me actually jump into the editor for this one. And what is actually happening here? So what we have, list view again, is we have a row. This is like the 3 cards are in a row block, and each of them is a stack block, right? And so a couple of things happen here. Stack now, so stack, when it shipped initially, it had an alignment value of left. It was all its items inside the stack block were always aligned to the left. And we call that justification, but in reality, under the hood, it's actually flex align. And by default, vertically aligned flex or vertical layout flex blocks will have their elements stretch to the full width of their container. But that wasn't happening with ours because we were giving them an alignment value that aligned everything to the left. And so, for instance, a buttons block that was in here, so if the stack block wasn't actually set to stretch, this would be the default display. The button, because there's only one button, it just occupies the space that it, the space that the button takes up, and it's not possible to center it. But when you set all of the items, so when you use this brand new stretch control that allows us to stretch all the items inside the stack block to occupy their full width, it's now possible to center buttons inside the stack block. So that's buttons block nested inside the stack, and then the actual button is nested inside the buttons block, of course. And the other thing is with, well, the variable amount of content, it wasn't possible to make buttons stick to the bottom. And that is now possible because of that control that we've already shown, which is, so height for children of stack set to fill will just take out all the space. A further little thing, so here's something that I think, this is still a work in progress, right? I think this is an improvement over what we had in 6.1. Definitely, it allows a lot more flexibility, but there's still cases where I think the experience could be further improved. And one of them is where, so inside my row block, I have 3 stack blocks, right? And to make them all have the exact same width, to make them all exactly the same size, I have actually had to set each stack to a fixed width. So go in styles, and each stack as a child of row has a width control, and I've actually set that to fix 33%, and that's how I managed to get 3 identical columns. Now, this is something that should be easier if we just wanted sort of any amount of columns of the same width. We should have sort of a setting that would just do that automatically. We shouldn't have to set width individually on each column that we have and actually do the maths like it's 33% because there are 3 columns. But if there were 5 columns, it would be like 20%. And so you kind of have to think your way through this whole process. So yeah, so that's something that I'm hoping will be improved with a possibly forthcoming grid layout type, which there is a pull request in progress for. I don't know if you want me to show any of that.
I was just about to jump in to be like, I think this would be a great time to talk about grid. And I also, I mean, just to pause and say thank you for demoing all this. And personally, I guess this will relate to the grid layout, but I'm curious because I know you spend a lot of time in GitHub going back and forth with people. Like if you wanted to pause and give like, common misconceptions people have, or like little tips and tricks, or I know you're more of a developer than designer, but I think for people to take full advantage of these controls, a lot of them like either aren't aware or don't know how to use them to the best of their ability. So I don't know if anything comes to mind. I think like the about like, using fill as the best one kind of thing, or showing actual different layouts is huge, but I wasn't sure if anything else came to mind.
I mean, that was the intent, and why I also did the talk at WordCamp Asia was because I was really getting the feeling that after these things shipped in the plugin, there were still folks going, but it's not possible to do this, and like, oh, actually now it is possible. We've just got this brand new thing out, and it's really exciting. Of course, when things are still in the plugin, of course, they're not going to be as widely known as when they're in core. So hopefully, with all the dev notes and all the the sort of publicizing of 6.2 features, then this is they're going to become more widely known. But yeah, it's mostly, I think, a lot of the questions super specific things appear from time to time. Quite often folks do report actual bugs when someone writes an issue going, this weird behavior, is this expected? How can I work around this? I'm like, oh no, that's a bug. Actually, we have a massive amount of bugs around. Like, I don't want to say maybe not every week, but like at least a couple of months we get bugs related to root padding, because the sort of smart root padding behavior that was implemented ambitiously tried to do. And yeah, it's been interesting. So yeah, if you do see something that you think is strange, please just continue to report everything. If you see something that doesn't work as expected, then there's a fair chance that it is actually not working as expected. So please let everyone know.
I was just telling someone that earlier. I was like, that's actually a bug. Let's report that. Yeah, it would be great to jump into Grid. And my internet weirdly just dropped twice. So if I completely drop off, please continue if you can. And I don't know if it's going to make someone else host, but I just wanted to mention that before, in case I disappear.
Okay, so let me see where I have now.
That's that last point that, for me personally, it's always the best way to learn is just to start tinkering with things, and particularly in this case where there's different combinations of align, justify, and width and height. If you start playing around with those combinations, you can start building up that mental model. For designers as well, a lot of these conventions follow tools like Figma and Framer and other design tools that adopt an auto layout sort of way of working, so the fit and fill. So if you have worked on those tools, then you probably pick this up quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, that was something actually, someone mentioned that to me at WordCamp Asia. They were like, you're modeling your tools on Figma, which is really cool. Like, please do more of that. Okay, where are we? I think I have a post with Grid. So I am on, I forget if I did 2 draft pull requests in quick succession, and I now no longer know what branch I'm on, so it's quite possible. Oh no, the Grid block is erroring, so I'm not on the Grid branch. Okay, I might have to build this again. I don't know if you want to like chat about stuff while I get my local environment sorted out. I mean, I could just like show you the page with the pull request, but that won't really do much. It's better to
No, this is totally cool.
Nice.
I wonder, Saxon, I know you have some stuff with Grid as well related to this, but I don't know if it would. I imagine it might take a while to build that.
We can maybe we can just talk a little bit about like just the vision of layout and maybe some of the challenges that we want to attempt to solve, I suppose. I can just share my screen during that process if you want.
Okay, then I can stop sharing and you can jump in and show you.
I'm particularly interested from the design perspective how we can make it easier for end users, and because we can't just be relying on using patterns and that sort of thing. We do need to have something in the interface that's a bit more comprehensive, where people aren't going to tinker as much. So
yeah. Well, actually, patterns is I do think is an interesting option for like as we start to lean more into patterns. I think that will definitely help end users with layout by providing predefined.
the wireframe patterns.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So these are just my own personal sort of goals or challenges I think that we can work towards, just broad opportunities, I suppose. The first is, like we mentioned, just making layout more accessible to more people, particularly end users who don't have a lot of technical knowledge. So questions in GitHub and around how to do this sort of layout or that sort of layout. It'd be nice to make it feel a bit more intuitive. And so there's a few challenges that we have currently that at least from my own experience, that I still kind of trip up on occasionally. The first is like some of these settings around, for example, inner blocks use content with, that always trips me up. I know that there's been a lot of back and forth around that particular point, but little details like that, I think we can help with. Might we introduce a free form way of laying things out? So like, I think particularly for end users who are less technical, sort of the urge is just to sketch something, right? It's just to draw something on the screen. If they've used other tools, more freeform, like tools that maybe use absolute positioning and whatnot, you kind of just draw things on, which isn't possible when you want something a bit more structured. But there's probably ways that we can introduce that sort of working in the canvas and kind of stepping stones towards that, and just make it a bit easier while still having that underlying structure. For example, just going into some concepts which are part of a discussion in GitHub, where this idea of grid, which Isabel's about to demo some of the first stages of that, but this idea of where you can add a grid to your layout, and then you can essentially just start drawing on top of that grid. So if I want to add some columns here and add some rows, I can go do that, and it's all powered by a CSS grid behind the scenes. And so this sort of way of working, I think, would work well for users who are less technical. From a technical side of things, like actually building this, there are a lot of challenges, particularly around responsive behavior as well, that we need to figure out. But it's an interesting vision to kind of start working towards, I think. The second point is, around the speed at which you can design layouts. So we mentioned Figma before. I think this is particularly if we want to start attracting more designers into the ecosystem. I think if you look at Figma and the power and the speed at which you can build pages, it'd be nice to get to that point where things feel really fluid, and there are shortcuts for certain tools, which we've made huge improvements for 6.2. But there's probably some work to do there as well. For example, I know there's been some discussions around which fields should we show by default, which fields should we hide by default, like height and setting as an example. Toggling that on and off constantly can be a pain for certain people. And then just, finally, like what's on my mind here is just expanding what's possible. But, based on what we've just shown, I think we've covered a lot of the main scenarios. It's just kind of, I suppose, making some of those workflows a bit more efficient. But there still are certain things to think about and discuss and ideate on, like when you want to overlap designs, which I know we're looking at, like negative margins at the moment, which will help.
That issue is like so commented on. It comes up all the time with negative margins. So I'll link to these GitHub issues that are referenced, by the way, just for everyone's awareness.
And responsive behavior, which is a constant topic. We're kind of leaning more into the intrinsic way of working, but I'm guessing we'll continually have requests and discussions around, like, certain users want more control than what is automatically given to them. So that's another kind of I guess I'd call it like a advanced feature that we need to think about. So those are just things on my mind as a designer, as some of the challenges and pain points and just opportunities for us to think about when it comes to layout. Another point around this first opportunity here, which is just around simplifying, is the fact that we do have multiple block types at the moment. So we have this group, which you can obviously turn into a row and a stack, but then we also have the columns block as well, which is another way of doing certain things. And hopefully this, based on the grid work that Isabel's about to show, hopefully this will eventually we can kind of start to deprioritize the columns block and kind of start to promote more of a unified way of laying things out, which I think would be really nice.
Yeah, and while you're on there, do you mind just adding a group block and showing if you're using, it should show, I just want to show off the different variations, the setup state. So if you just add like a new
For a
group
group block,
block.
for the
Yeah.
starting state. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you
because
can
I
see
think
this
this is
is already
another.
signed.
Mhm.
Yeah, kind of inversion overlap with the columns block there.
And it's so interesting because it's like we both need to think about like the average user with no technical knowledge, and then also like you're talking about how do we attract designers, how do we help block theme authors get where they want to go. And so it's neat to see all these different tools being added, and then also like simple things like this. It's like, hey, you're creating a group block, what kind of layout do you want, and having it be visual and easy just as a setup state.
Yeah, yeah. These are almost, I mean, this is really just shortcuts. So I'd love to think more about that, where there's shortcuts into sort of predefined settings, which I think, which almost, well, patterns are kind of essentially that in a way. But
Patterns and
little,
even block transforms too. Like I think having easier block transforms would be neat.
yeah, even just this behavior that I don't know when this was introduced, but by selecting, if you select 2 layers here, and then you can just transfer that into a row. I think that's little details like that. I think will go a long way in attracting designers in particular who are sort of power users when it comes to laying things out. So kudos to whoever introduced that, because that's awesome.
I think that was Matthias, and I think that was like 6.1 if I'm not mistaken. I have like a memory of him saying something about that in a GitHub issue somewhere. Like, why can't we just select these and make it? And I think that, yeah, like you're talking about those little things as well as just better transforms, maybe even. I think the tool is improving with the orientation, having it automatically switching the different row to stack was also a neat enhancement as well. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff coming together.
Yeah, I think we have most of the tools, or a lot of the tools. It's just kind of packaging them up in the right way. And just another point, which is just an interesting one to think about, is we all know the wave of AI stuff hitting, becoming available, and it's interesting to think about this idea of just sketching on the canvas, which I know a lot of us are starting to think about. But being able to interpret a sketch and change that into a layout is also interesting. And just in general, how AI will change how we interact with the canvas in the future. Just a little sort of interesting thing to start considering. So that's basically what's on my mind as a designer, and I think it's awesome to see a lot of movement around layout. I think theme authors in particular will open up so many more possibilities, and it's super important for WordPress as a whole, I think.
If you dreamed really big, like what would you tackle first? Like super blue sky thinking. Or straight to AI.
Well, yeah, I don't know if based off some of the demonstrations today, this might be possible, but I think it's worth thinking about sooner rather than later. We don't want to be late to the game if there are interesting possibilities there. But first of all, I'd love to just, I suppose, package up the tools that we already have, because there's so much that we can do right now. And just making them more accessible both to end users, but also to, like, designers like myself, who just like speed is really important in terms of how to design layouts. So I guess those things are kind of top of mind for me at the moment.
Yeah, another thing that sometimes comes up related to that is when people are editing styles versus like an individual block. So I think being able to edit the actual layout of your site as well is something that often comes up, or that's where like a lot of group padding issues come into play, where people are like, why is there margin here? I can't remove the margin on this. This is really annoying me. Why is there margin here? Like, I know early on with the calls for testing for the outreach program, that was a big piece of feedback, was that there was just margin in places where we didn't want it. And I think a lot of that has improved, but it still is hard to know like what is controlling which part of the site. That also to me impacts like the entire layout, beyond just building out a layout of something, but impacts the entire experience of the site. And I do think like the zoomed out mode, where you're looking out and able to kind of see your site from the whole of your site a bit more, and switching between patterns, is also another way to make layout more accessible in the future, which I know is being looked at. So, relying on, okay, I want 3 columns that are all equal size versus like, I want 3 things like a skew versus whatever. You could just imagine switching between patterns and basically getting different layouts also as a way to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I suppose that's like a dream, is just to get to a point where a lot of end users don't have to think about layout. Like the patterns are there for them to use. It knows exactly what they want based on, I mean, we think about sketching and whatnot, and that's kind of the dream, is to not have to go into this level of granularity when it comes to layout tools. But yeah, lots of exciting things to think about.
Yeah, I'm particularly excited about switching between patterns in the future. I think that's going to really unlock some stuff for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for going through that. Isabel, do you want us to tell some jokes? We can tell some jokes if you. On, you're muted, I think. Mark is also asking in the chat. I think you're still trying to talk, Isabel, and we cannot hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I was muted. Yeah, my local environment doesn't seem to be working correctly. And so as that was what I was counting on in order to be able to showcase the grid work, I actually don't have anything to show to you at this moment. I'm not quite sure. I'll have to actually probably rebuild this is something that happens from time to time. It just sort of goes berserk.
You want me to try and spin up my local environment?
Oh, yes, please. If you can do it with that PR branch.
It's just try grid layout. That's the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured out the post template one. I'll drop a link to the GitHub issue or the pull request rather.
Sure, it was working.
Maybe you can just, I'll share my screen and you can just direct me.
Yeah.
Talk through if you want. So yeah, with this new option here, but maybe I'll start with a group. You can talk through.
Yeah, so in the placeholder, you can see that there is now a fourth option, which is grid. I totally hacked that SVG for the grid together, that one that appears in the placeholder. So you might want to go and have a look at it and make it nicer at some point. And if you click there, you will get what looks very much like the row layout, which is a group block with a little block inserter in it. But if you actually start adding blocks, you'll see that they behave in more of a grid-like fashion. And the default, so this is a very early draft. There's, it could go in any direction, but I thought that a sensible default for grid would be to have it be responsive. So have the number of columns depend on the page width, or the container width, I should say. And that's accomplished by using autofill with a sort of a repeating autofill grid template setting. And what we control in that type of layout is actually the minimum width of the blocks. And so I forget, I did something, is that 20 rem? That's, I set some default that seemed sensible. Again, all of this is in early draft mode, so it's very much open to discussion. But the idea is there'll be a sensible default minimum width, and then it can be set. So you can go in and set whatever minimum width you like, depending on if you want like bigger or smaller blocks. And then the number of columns will depend on how much space there is for the columns to fit. It can fit 6 or 4 or 2, depending on the width of the screen. So that's kind of responsive out of the box, which is really, I think, the easiest way to do things. But there's, so Saxon in the demo that he did and added to that grid issue, there were 2 variants of grid layout. There was that, what essentially was that one. And then there was another one where you could choose a number of columns. So like a static number of columns, and then those columns would just shrink as the screen goes narrower. And then you can end up with like 6 super narrow columns on a phone screen. So I thought, for completeness sake, I would try that too. And so the layout sidebar has that responsive toggle where if you toggle responsive off, you can choose the number of columns that you want, and then that number of columns will be static no matter what the width of the container is. And so that's the draft as it stands. I saw that Johan left some interesting feedback overnight where he was like, maybe we don't want to do the static thing yet because it doesn't look quite ready. I mean, it can be useful, but I don't think I've ever actually encountered a practical case where you would want to have a static number of columns and not have any kind of responsive behavior. That could very easily go wrong. So that's something that I think kind of needs to be thought a bit more in depth, like how should that behave? Should there be some sort of responsiveness behind the scenes, reducing the number of columns for narrow screens, a bit like we have with the stack option in the columns block, or should it be user set? I know folks have been clamoring for responsive controls for a while. Is that something that would be useful? Is that something that can be done in a sensible way? These are all sorts of questions that are open.
Yeah, if we think about the responsive behavior of static columns, I'd almost consider this like the max number of columns that you can set. So as you scale down, like if we did want to introduce some responsiveness to this, it would kind of gradually reduce the number of columns based on like a predefined, like maybe minimum size or something, like just like the responsive. So there's some overlap between those two things. But to me, this starts to gets to a point where we talked before about kind of unifying layout, where this gets to a point where it could almost just replace the columns block if you had blocks, block spacing, and we had the responsive stuff in there as well. So it's just one central place where you can start laying things out, which I think is really important. But it is tricky to get right. They're responsive, particularly if we don't give the user control over that. If we're trying to create the best possible defaults, it's very challenging.
Yeah. I think either way, whether it's user controlled or not, I think this would be a very good opportunity to explore container queries, particularly because if we're going to have this responsive behavior in a block and we have no idea what percentage of the screen that block occupies, then it would be sensible to use container queries instead of media queries.
Ed, yeah, I was like, love the hand raise.
Is that the question?
Yeah, I love this this layout. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Ed Beck. I work in higher ed, and so I often teach students how to use WordPress for like their own individual sites or project sites. So I really like how simple this is. I know that in the plugin market, many options try to create responsive by putting that little icon of the mobile tablet and then the screen there. And I like that yours didn't have that, because that just seems to be a lot of dials to control and can be a real complex thing. So I like that layout. I wondered what would happen if just one of your blocks was like 4 lines long, how that would look compared to the other grids, if that would keep the boxes similar height when they're there, or what kind of, because that's a problem that we often see.
It should, out of the box, it should keep them a similar height.
Yeah, I really like that. I hope that can be incorporated in some of the patterns and things that we use for query loops, because I know that's something that people really like to see, is like if they're using posts, or using a query block for posts, they want to see that they're all the same height and that they line up nicely and things like that. So I like that that's built in too.
Yeah, and that's actually it's a default in CSS grid. That's sort of a CSS spec thing, really. That's what it does by default. The styling, I mean, if you want to go in and look at that, has that draft PR been shared on the?
I dropped it in the chat, but let me share it again.
Yeah, cool. So that last link in the chat, that's the link to the draft pull request. If you want to, like, you can go have a look at the code. It is really simple. Like it's 2 lines of CSS. It really doesn't have a lot in there. And that's the thing that's amazing about CSS Grid, is that you can accomplish a lot with actually very little code.
Yeah, I really want to try this out. Like, I almost wonder, depending upon how far this gets with the draft, if it doesn't make it into the Gutenberg plugin, or if it makes it in as like a behind the experimental flag, I think this would be really great to test and have people do everything from like creating patterns or just starting from scratch. Kind of exploring that stuff, because this is, and especially the responsive and intrinsic responsiveness, I think will be huge.
Yeah, and that's super useful to see how folks are actually using these controls in real life, because from my perspective, I do a lot more building tools than actually building websites. So I really need to get that feedback and know how folks are using things and what the pain points are.
Yeah, honestly, the draft PR, the PR doesn't feel like too far off being as an experimental feature. There are certain things like block spacing and stuff that we can add, and we've talked about if you want certain columns or items in the grid to span multiple columns as well. But this is a really great starting point that is already functional. If you think about like a gallery example, a gallery of images, I know we have blocks for that, but just that sort of layout where it's just a responsive grid works really well for that. Anything else you want to show with this grid, or?
No, I mean that's pretty much what it does for now. I had another draft PR trying to add that grid logic to the post template block, but that's something else I think that needs a lot of further discussion. That's already sort of an application of it, I guess.
I think that one's going to be huge as well, just with the query loop block and that whole experience. It's just such a common pathway for people to want to use that. I'll add this to I'm working just behind the scenes outreach program stuff with the navigation section being removed from the site editor. I'm trying to spin up a call for testing pretty soon about that. And then also if we can fit something like this in, I think it'd be really dynamic and cool to kind of show off some of what's been done, like since I've been so 6.2 focused, but development has continued and there's a lot being done to still move things forward. So stay tuned there if you want to give feedback. I'm curious if anyone has any other questions or comments or concerns or anything. Okay, I always just like to, we have a last minute, another Aussie. Amazing. Hey, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan.
We're just at the tail end with a Q&A section. So if you have any off the cuff, no prep
I don't. I actually came to just fly on the wall.
Amazing. There'll be a recap, so don't worry.
Jordan, I was going to put you on the spot because I think you'd have a lot of insights into like challenges around layout that certain people might use, but maybe that can be a follow-up to give you time to think about it.
The one that was brought up in a meeting I was in this morning was just related to the logic surrounding when group blocks have alignment and width settings, and the toggling on using inner block width and those kinds of things. I personally, I know there are rules. I can't always remember or figure out what they are at the time. And so when working with folks, often we'll have this kind of situation of, I really want to make this section full width. And you're trying grouping things and ungrouping things and unnesting and renesting and possibly it's just my level of knowledge of that hierarchy or the rules around that to know, oh, this is this situation, I don't need to get it to here. But I do know that is a thing that comes up commonly.
And just for context, Jordan also works for Automatic in the WordPress.com side. So just for everyone to understand kind of the context of that, of working with tons of customers all the time.
Yeah. So spending time kind of trying to walk people through making changes in the site editor. In real time.
Yeah, no, that's a big one. I know, especially with the alignment, Isabel, you had a great demo of that of just want my site title next to my site logo. Why is this so hard? That came up a lot too.
Was that specifically about that toggle for inner blocks using content width, or because there's been a lot of back and forth about that one too. It was initially, I forget, it was called something else, that the text on that toggle has been changed about
so
3
many
times.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're there yet because it's still not super clear what it does. It's a complex concept. It's kind of hard to explain. It just does one thing, essentially. That's the frustrating. It's it does one thing, but it's just something that is not obvious and it's very hard to explain.
Yeah,
I want to Oh, sorry. I was about to say, Saxon, I was going to share one of your issues actually, like related to
Oh
this.
yeah.
Ignore all my tabs, but this also came up. Exactly this, like, I think I was trying to find the original. Yeah, inherit default layout was like the original text. And this has since like evolved and evolved and evolved because it is a very confusing setting. And like I think we changed when it was turned on by default versus when it was turned off. Like that was the other thing, is we changed the on off aspect of it, which also had another layer of confusion. So I'll make sure to drop these two in as well. And I don't know, Saxon, if you wanted to talk a little bit about this. So this is another one of those issues that I have like basically saved in my browser history because I feel like I come back to it all the time.
Yeah, this one was when I first started to dive into layout, and it was a while ago, but it does touch on that point around the inner block width, where I think the problem isn't necessarily just in the label. It's kind of just more of like holistically with some issues with it. To me, I kind of mentally, I think of it more as like a setting the inner block width, like default inner block width for children is essentially it. But yeah, if anyone wants to check that issue out, have a read through it. It's it kind of goes into some details and different combinations of certain things, like whether it's a row or a stack. But that is, yeah, as we talked about earlier, I think that's definitely the inner block toggle is something that we should, I know it's been revisited a lot, but just to continue to think about, and maybe there are solutions outside the box that we can consider as well. Although I know like backwards compatibility makes it a bit challenging.
Yeah, totally agree. The last thing I realized we didn't even talk about the sticky positioning stuff, which to me relates to layout. I did want to briefly call that out. Do you want to talk about it? Because I think that's another
It does. Yeah, it is. And initially, the initial thinking around it was going to be another layout type, but then that doesn't really make sense, because how layout is built, you can only have one type of layout on a block at a time. So you can switch between types of layout. But the sticky positioning, or I mean, positioning in general, sticky being the only type of position that's available currently, that is something that you might want to add to a block in addition to its internal layout. So because it's more about how that block behaves in relation to the rest of the canvas, and whereas layout is more about how the inner blocks behave. So it's more sort of a thing that applies to the blocks inside the container block, whereas positioning will do something, will position the block relative to the rest of the page. It's a bit different. And so it was thought to be easier to just make it a separate control. Not it's the way it works internally is quite similar to layout, and you know, it's still in very initial phases. It's still in, yeah. So what's shipping? I don't know. You want to demo that, or?
Oh yeah, this is that theme. Yeah, I was gonna say Saxon's showing a cool theme that's in progress right now.
Ah, nice. Yeah.
And you're muted right now, Saxon. I don't know if you're trying to talk. I can't actually see if you are.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I think this is, while you're talking through, I can show it on screen here. This is just an example of a theme that makes use of sticky block pretty heavily, like for each section, essentially.
That's really cool. What theme is it?
It's just a quick one I threw together. That's actually been added to the community themes, just to demo sticky position. So you can, that makes for it opens up some interesting possibilities if you're a theme author.
Yeah, it does. And currently there's a limitation on it where it can only be applied to root blocks, so blocks at the root layout level. Whether in the site editor or the post editor, you can also apply it to root blocks in the post editor. You can't apply it to nested blocks. And that is because of the way that sticky positioning works as sort of a CSS property. Sticky blocks are always sticky relative to their container. And so if the sticky controls are available for any block, there's there's a high probability that someone will try to add sticky to a block that's inside, that's sort of the only block in its container, and then it won't actually do anything. So because it only works in certain circumstances, this is still something, you know, as a V1, it was thought to be better to only allow sticky positioning at the root level, because there it's almost certainly going to work. You're going to, you know, if you have scrollable content, then you'll be able to make a block sticky. But ideally, it should be available to other types of blocks, but there's something that still needs a lot of thinking through, is how and when to make it available, because it won't work if your block is sort of, if you have a paragraph inside the group block and you try to make that paragraph sticky, that won't work. You can't do it because there won't be scrollable content in the block's immediate container. So there's that sort of, you know, that's also, I think, very much a kind of a UI problem, like how to make these controls available in a way that they make sense and that they will always work.
Yeah, and I totally, this is something that also touches on like interesting ways of solving this. And this is one of the things I want to point out is like, you know, you're thinking from the technical side, and it's like, it is a UI problem. It's like, what if we had a group block that was sticky, or a way to kind of, you know, share that more explicitly in the interface as you're interacting with the editor. So I don't really know where this is going to end up, but I did want to note just a lot of follow-up tasks here. So 6.2 does include this initial in the root. It has to be in the root level, the group block, which is pretty exciting. But so you basically have to wrap like a template part in a group block and then set the group block to position sticky. So it's a little bit cumbersome, but in theory, I think there's some interesting like follow-up tasks to be done after 6.2. And as you were saying, like early implementation also means great time to give feedback. So I'll make sure this is also in the notes.
Yeah.
Looking to.
Yeah, and then there's the matter of controlling Z indexes and stuff like that, which is also coming up in that I shared a draft PR of negative margins in the comments, and that's also something that will rely on Z index. So that's sort of, it's kind of a constellation of problems that will probably need to be thought about in tandem.
Is this your PR? No, yeah, this is right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. I gave it a spin the other day and it's like, it's really awesome. You can do so much cool stuff with it.
All right, I want this one also behind an experimental flag and I want to test it. I want to get folks getting feedback. I think this would be really neat.
Hey.
Yeah, this is cool. All right, we're coming up on the hour, so I want to be respectful of people's time. Is there any last minute? I just had to throw out the sticky positioning. That's another cool thing to look forward to, but otherwise we can wrap up. All right, we'll wrap up. Thank you both so much. This was like, I feel like I learned stuff and also got like all sorts of excited all over again. I really appreciate you all joining, and I will recap this and post it on the Make Test site. So stay tuned. I normally can get these done pretty quickly, so it should be up pretty soon. And I just really appreciate all joining and sharing your different perspectives. It's all really, really helpful. Sweet. I'll see you on Slack.
Cool.
Yeah, of course.
See you. Thanks.
Thanks.